Beautiful. Yeah.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Seth Benzell. He is a postdoctoral associate at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. He's a member of the group of Productivity, Employment, and Inequality, and he holds a PhD in economics from Boston University. But what, for me at least, is really amazing is that he has a bachelor in economics and a bachelor in physics and mathematics. So it's a very nice mixed, very nice. And probably it explains why most of his papers are made of a lot of equations, even more than the papers of our colleagues of the theoretical physics. Well, I met Seth at MIT. I was in Wesley, it's very close to Boston, in Babson College, and in fact I had a lot of meetings in MIT, particularly in the MIT Sloan Business School, which is a very famous center in the world. And probably, I don't know, probably you could explain something about the initiative on the digital economy, because from, as far as I know, is probably the most important initiative around digital economy all over the world. It could be. Well, okay, you can explain.
I'm happy to accept the praise.
Yeah, sure. So I met him in one of those meetings, and he was very kind with me. We kept a very nice conversation, at least from my point of view, around intelligent automation. In part, he's going to talk about intelligent automation and the impact in the economy. So it's your time, and thank you very much for coming. It's very kind of you.
Thank you so much, Zenon. I'll start by saying I really enjoyed meeting Zenon when he came out to MIT. We had a really amazing discussion about these new technologies. He told me about your guys' research center here, which sounded so cool. And I said, well, the next time I'm in Spain, I have to come out and give a lecture. And so thank goodness it worked out, and I'm really pleased to be here and to enjoy this wonderful and historic city. To tell you a little bit about the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, it's a really sort of interesting interdisciplinary group over at MIT that's got a mix of economists, business academics, so people with PhDs in strategy or PhDs in marketing, and computer scientists. And so some very top thinkers about how this new digital economy works, people like Erik Brynjolfsson and Sinan Aral, are leaders of the initiative. It's not just people who work at MIT, it's also professors at other universities who are affiliated with the center. And there's a lot of really interesting research going on there. So I encourage any of you, find yourselves in Boston, to come around and say hi. As Senan said, I've been a postdoc there for a year and a half after finishing my PhD in economics, and I can't imagine kind of a more interesting place to start doing some interdisciplinary research on these topics. So I understand lots of you are kind of hands-on with the technology. There's going to be a couple of slides where I kind of get more into depth about AI and machine learning and what those things mean. So I'm sure for many of you that's going to be old hat, so bear with me and maybe I'll go through those a little bit faster. So when asking the question, how have these new technologies impacted and going to continue to impact the economy, one challenge is that it's really hard to, technology is kind of in itself really sort of hard to predict, right? If we knew exactly what the technology of tomorrow was, we'd already have invented it, and there wouldn't be anything to invent. So that's why I think in a presentation like this, where we want to talk about how do we think new technologies are going to affect the economy, the best place to start is looking backwards at the last 30 or so years and to see how have technologies been changing the economy so far. So I'm going to start by kind of a recap of the last 30 years. How do we think that, how has the economy changed, and how can we tie those changes to new technologies? Next, I'll kind of extrapolate further. I'll get on a little bit more thinner ice and try to think a little bit about these new technologies, what they might constitute, and why you might think that the changes they bring on are going to be equally dramatic, if not more dramatic. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about policy of different sorts. Pensions is just one thing I've been thinking about recently, but all different sorts of policy implications for these changes. All right, so how have technologies changed the economy? I want to focus on three big changes. So the first is a decrease in labor's share of income. The second is employment polarization. And the third is superstar economics for firms and workers. And again, I think there's strong evidence tying all of these changes to technological changes. So the first is a decrease in labor's share of income. So what I've got up here now is a bank of figures. It's not super important that you can read the axes, which describe labor's share of income for different OECD countries, so developed countries. So what is labor's share of income? So an economist, when they're thinking about the economy, they want to sort of slice up the economy different ways. One way to slice up the economy is into all of the money that's made by workers, people who go to a job and collect a paycheck, versus all of the money that's made by other people. So money that's made by people who own businesses, who own stocks and bonds, people who own land or capital that they rent out to other people, or people who own some other sort of asset that has a rate of return. So labor's share of income is just all of the money that's made by workers in the economy divided by the total production, the GDP of the country. And what's clear here is that sort of across the developed world, labor's share of income has been decreasing. So the first paper to document this comprehensively is Kara Barbunas and Neiman, 2014. And they show that, again, across the developed world, it's gone down by an average of about 5 percentage points. This is particularly surprising because sort of a constant labor share of income going into 1980 had been sort of one of the most important stylized facts of economics, right? So if you look at the US in particular, from around 1800, as early as the US started measuring this, through around 1980, labor share of income had been really pretty constant at around 2/3. And if any of you have taken like a macroeconomics class, you'll know that the most common aggregate production function used to model the economy is something called the Cobb-Douglas production function. And the Cobb-Douglas production function is designed to get this, that no matter what's going on, 2/3 of the money will be paid to workers, and 1/3 of the money will be paid to people who own machines and equipment and land. But again, since 1980, this has been decreasing. And in Spain, the decrease has actually been even a little bit more steep. It's decreased from 68% to 60%. Here's Spain up here. How can we tie these changes to new technologies? So the first way is just to think about what do we mean by automation, right? If by automation we mean there's a job that used to be done by labor, which is now being done by a machine or some sort of automated system, well, it stands to reason that that automation is going to lower the amount of money that you're paying to workers and raise the share of money that you're paying to everyone else. Another way to tie these ideas together has been done in a number of studies that have looked at regions or firms that have been exposed to the introduction of industrial robots. So here's a study by Asamoglu and Restrepo that just came out that looks at regions in the United States that were exposed to using industrial robots. And they find that one more robot per 1,000 workers reduces employment by about 0.2%, decreases wages by up to 0.5%, and increases GDP by 0.13%. So again, there's an example. Output's going up, but the amount being paid to workers is going down. So that's labor share going down. The second fact about the developed world that's been going on that I want to bring your attention to is employment polarization. So across these developed countries, what's been the trend is that there's been a reduction in jobs that are sort of middle paying and an increase in the amount of employment that's at the very high, that's in the top third of the wage distribution, and an increase in employment that's in the bottom third of the wage distribution. So this is called polarization. We both see this in terms of employment growth, that the employment growth is faster at the two extremes than at the middle, and in terms of wage growth. So people who started off making the kinds of jobs that started off making middle wages in the beginning of the period under study. Again, this particular study starts in 1993, but these trends seem to start in 1985 or 1980s, depending on which country exactly where you look. Wages have polarized as well. For Spain, the change is actually a little bit different, maybe explains part of the rise in unemployment in Spain. So Spain, you see 12% decrease in these middle wage jobs, 10% or 11% increase in these high wage jobs, and only a small increase in the low wage jobs. So it's a way in which Spain is a little bit of an outlier compared to a lot of other countries that have seen more growth in the low end jobs as well, in addition to the collapse of the middle wage jobs. Yeah?
Can you identify these three categories with low, middle, and high skilled workers?
So, okay, that's a good question. Economics, I find economists talk about this. So the question was, can I identify the categories of low wage, medium wage, and high wage with low skill, medium skill, and high skill? The short answer is people do. People do make that exact equivalence. I think that equivalence is a little bit problematic. Just because someone is not being paid a lot doesn't mean that they're not high skilled. You can imagine like a very skilled artist being paid not very much. But often in economics papers, they'll call this skill bias technological change. Even if you really wanted to call it, if you wanted to be really agnostic, you would call it something like middle wage job decreasing technological change. All right, so how can we tie those changes, that decrease in middle wage jobs, to a technological change? This is another very famous paper called by Autor and Dorn in 2013, called something like The Growth in Low-Skilled Service Jobs and the Polarization of American Employment. And what they do is they compare two different groups of counties in the United States. So the high dashed line is groups of counties that started off the period in, I think this is 1980, this starts, with lots of very routine intensive. So these are places that have a lot of desk jobs, administrative jobs, or factory work jobs, versus counties that had fewer routine workers, right? And what do we see? So what this graph says is the change in employment. So as you can see, for the dashed line, so these are counties that had lots of routine workers, saw more dramatic decreases in employment in these middle wage jobs. They also saw more adoption of information and communication technologies. So they're bringing in computers, they're bringing in the sort of robots that we think are going to be substitutes for routine jobs. And this is employment polarization. They also saw more wage polarization, and they also saw more skilled labor come in. So perhaps in order to operate all of these new machines, you need skilled workers to come into your region. Okay. There's another question. This is ongoing research, is looking into to what extent this change is people moving into occupations that, people moving, okay. I told you, there was a decrease in middle wage jobs. Then I started telling you about routine jobs. It turns out most routine jobs are middle wage. And that's sort of intuitive. If you think about the sorts of jobs that are getting automated, you think that they're going to mostly be kind of factory line jobs that you get replaced with industrial robots, or sort of administrative office jobs that are not the lowest skilled, they're not the lowest paid work, they're sort of middle paid work, or you saw in that figure like 30 percentile work. In this figure, I divide up occupations from the least routine to the most routine, right? And we ask, how much employment growth has there been in these different occupations? This is for US publicly traded firms, so large companies. You see, the least routine jobs added about there were 5 million employees added that were not routine, in non-routine jobs, and about 2 million employees added in the most routine jobs. So in other words, about 2.95 million more least routine jobs than most routine jobs were added. Now what this figure does is it breaks down that change into changes due to firms that always had routine workers non-routine workers growing faster than firms that don't have non-routine workers, versus firms actually changing their employment mix. So one story for what I showed you before was maybe Americans don't want to have manufactured goods anymore, and they want to spend more of their money on services and stuff that's made by non-routine workers. Then what you would expect to see is firms that provide goods grow faster, and therefore they hire less routine workers, and firms that provide services, they grew slower, and then firms that provide services grow faster, get more employees, and because that's what people demand. The alternative, like I say, is firms changing their mix of employees due to these new technologies, and we find a role for both. So these green bars are how many employees of each type you would have expected to see added in each type if every firm had kept their mix of workers constant, right? So now imagine every firm from the year 2000 to year 2016 had kept their mix of workers constant but grew in employment. We would have still expected to see more routine workers added than, non-routine workers added than routine workers. And in fact, about 50% of the total difference in employment growth from the least routine to the most routine jobs is due to this across-firm effect. Then if you take then this red bar is any change in employment of these different types that's not explained by there was more growth in non-routine firms than routine firms has to be due to firms changing their mix of workers. And you can see, so if you subtract this red bar from that red bar, that explains about 30% of the aggregate movement to least routine jobs from most routine jobs. And then finally, another 20% comes from net entry. So firms that tended to join the market tended to have more so new firms over the interval tended to hire more non-routine workers than routine workers. So in other words, there's a role for for firms that always employed non-routine people growing faster, firms switching their mix from routine workers to non-routine workers, and new firms showing up favoring non-routine workers. All three of those contributed to the relative growth of non-routine versus routine jobs in publicly traded US firms from 2000 to 2016. The final thing I want to talk about is the growth of superstar economics. So I'll show you the figures first. So this figure here shows the share of labor income that's paid to people in different labor income groups. So this bar here shows the percentage of all wages that are paid to people in the bottom 25%. This is for the people in the 25th to 50th percent. This is from the 50th percent to the 75th percent. This is from the 75th percent to the 100%, so the top 25% highest paid people. As you can see, for the bottom 75%, their share of the wage bill has been decreasing, whereas for the top 25%, their share of the wage bill has been going up, right? So this kind of goes along with what I've been showing you before, that there's been a lot of wage growth concentrated for top workers. But what's fascinating here is that as we zoom in from all workers to just the top 10%, you can see most of the change in the share of the wage bill that's being paid to the highest paid workers increase has been driven by the share increasingly going to the top 2.5%. So as you can see here, people from the top 10th percent to the top 7.5% through the top 2.5% to the percentages below the top 2.5% has remained relatively flat. But the share that's going to the top 2.5% of workers, and again, this is all America, has increased from a little over 10% in 1960 to a little over 20% in 2010. So within the high-paid workers making more money, it's really the really high-paid workers who are making a lot more money. But we can zoom in even further. Okay. If you look within the top 1%, most of the gains are being driven by the top 0.25%. If you look within the top 0.01%, most of the gains are being driven by the top 0.002.25%, right? So what you should take away from this is not only are we seeing polarization between low wage workers and high wage workers, within the rich, there's increasing polarization between the rich and the very rich, and then the very rich pulling very rich pulling away from the very rich, and then the super duper rich pulling away from the very rich, right? So why do we think that this has some sort of connection to technological change? Well, I'll give one theoretical answer and I'll give one empirical answer. So theoretically, there's a lot of reason to believe that digitization tends to lead to more sorts of winner-take-all markets, or as Rosen in his 1981 paper called it, the economics of superstars. And the story he tells in that paper is the following. So imagine you wanted to hear some music, you wanted to, for your party back in, the 1800s, right? You'd have to hire a band for your party, right? Whereas today, if you're throwing a party and you want to hear some music, one thing you might do is just turn on YouTube on your computer and stream whatever music you want to hear. And probably you're not going to stream some obscure band, you're going to stream one of the most popular bands that everybody listens to. So what you can see there is a change from a situation where everybody wanted to consume a service, which was music, and they paid for that by each small party hiring its own band, to a situation where still everybody wants to listen to music, and in fact, they listen to much more music than they listened to before. But rather that money being spread out to lots and lots of bands, it's all being concentrated towards one music delivery system, YouTube, and a handful of extremely popular bands that everybody listens to, right? And this sort of fractal pattern that you see here of the winners doing the super winners doing even better than winners is exactly what you would expect to see if there was sort of a Pareto distribution of quality, right? There are some really superstars that do better than the stars. Empirically, I'm working on some research right now that shows that industries that saw more investment in information and communication technologies see faster wage growth for their leadership positions, which is consistent with this, right? It's the idea that as your company gets bigger, as it becomes more connected, it becomes more essential to have a leader that's just a little bit better, and so you're going to pay them more. Some people speculate that the growth, obviously there might be some component of the growth in wages for the extremely high skilled that might have something to do with them exploiting the system. First of all, let me point out that all of this is pre-tax and transfers, right? So this is before the very high end are getting taxed at a higher rate than low-end workers. And certainly that could be part of the story, the fact that high-end workers are kind of exploiting the system, but there's kind of an influential literature review about this. I think it's this paper here in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that kind of shows that this isn't just CEOs exploiting their corporate boards to pay them more, that if you look at top law firms, if you look at the music industry, if you look across different industries, there's been sort of this explosion in the share that's being paid to the very, very high end. Okay. It's not just workers that are seeing these really dramatic polarization between the winners and the losers. We're seeing it across companies as well. So we were just talking, I was just talking with some of the faculty here about the fact that, in the old days, there used to be, you can imagine one of the ways like a local shopkeeper is able to make money is that he knows something about his local conditions. He's able to do little arbitrages. So I run the little shop on my corner. I know that the guy next door always likes this brand of toothpaste, so I always make sure to have it in stock. And that used to be an advantage that local producers used to have over these big, slow-moving behemoths that couldn't react to local changing conditions. The big behemoths didn't have the local information. But as information spreads, as technologies for the collection and the using of big data become more powerful, these previously big lumbering behemoths that couldn't react to local conditions are becoming better and better at sort of dealing with predicting things about individuals. If you think about how Netflix is so good at predicting what movie you want to see next, or if you think about how Amazon and Walmart are so good at their logistic chains and getting products exactly where people need them to be so that they never have an oversupply or an undersupply at any given store, that's all the harnessing of these data technologies that are giving a relative advantage to the biggest, most sophisticated players at the expense of these sort of small businesses. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that industry concentration is rising. This is mostly US data from this paper by Autor et al. The concentration of production in industries is rising. We see profits going up, but concentrating within a handful of firms. We see a growth in the intangible share of assets. So if you look at the value of these companies on the stock market, the value of the companies that's not explained by the physical capital they have is increasing, right? And that might represent the value of the data or the value of the technologies they've been able to implement. And then finally, again, this is from this paper, those sorts of industries that are getting the most concentrated, that are seeing the biggest rise in profits, are seeing the biggest decrease in the labor share, which is sort of tying all these ideas together. And here's just an example of how dramatically different these new companies are. Think about the problem of getting people from point A to point B. So two companies that solve that problem are BMW and Uber. BMW founded in 1916. These numbers are a couple years old. If I was going to give you today's numbers, the Uber, Airbnb, and Facebook numbers would be much bigger. But as of a couple of years ago, Uber's worth more than BMW, despite having dramatically fewer employees and despite not owning any factories, right? It's got a couple of office buildings. Meanwhile, BMW, giant factories, giant amounts of employees, worth less. Marriott versus Airbnb. Airbnb doesn't own any hotels, although I was just reading that Airbnb is thinking about opening up some boutique hotels. So that's an interesting direction to think about, which is companies that start as these platform businesses and then maybe move back into a more traditional value chain. Doesn't own any hotels, has very few employees, worth almost as much as Marriott. Facebook, providing entertainment communication, selling ads, worth dramatically more than Walt Disney with dramatically fewer employees. If you can become a platform business and make money off of this big data and making money off of coordinating between other people, you gain in two ways. You gain from just making the whole process more efficient. You help people coordinate with each other. And then you gain because you're kind of squeezing those small businesses and getting money that they used to make off of their arbitrages, because you're making the arbitrage better than they used to make it. And the last thing I'll say about this is that this is sort of a superstar effect, right? One of the other things we were talking about was that it doesn't really make sense for there to be two Facebooks, right? It makes sense for everyone to want to be on the same social network. It doesn't make it's sort of maybe Uber is going to be able to support a duopoly there with Lyft, but when you're a market maker, you're making your revenue, you're getting more productive with scale, because you only have to invent the platform once, right? If you have two different people developing their independent platforms, there's kind of a redundancy there. And then as the platform gets more users, the matching process gets more efficient. So there's a sense in which these are natural monopolies, which is similar to this sort of superstar thing that we saw with workers. OK, so that's where we've been. Now I'll talk a little bit about where we're going. The first thing I want to say is I've run into this term a lot in Spain, which is robotization. I prefer the term automation. I think when people think about robotization, they're thinking of like, humanoid robots like C-3PO. And obviously that's a little bit farther, that's much farther in the distant future than automation more generally. So I'm going to use the term automation. I encourage you, if you're talking to people about new technologies in the economy, to use automation, which is a much broader term. Talk a little bit about one new emerging AI technology that's really exciting, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning, and in particular an application of that, which is image recognition. Some of you guys know much more about this than me, but I'll show just sort of a toy example of that. And then thinking about, when we think about these technologies, is this going to be destroying jobs? Is this going to be creating jobs? Or is this going to be changing the nature of jobs? And I'm going to lean more towards that last answer and provide some evidence which suggests that the main trend is going to be changing what occupations entail more so than straight up eliminating or creating occupations. OK, so here's my video about a robot. And so this is Boston Dynamics. This is a company maybe some of you have heard of over in Cambridge. It was bought by Google for a while and then went independent again. I think is now owned by a Japanese holding company. As you can see, the robot's trying to pick up the box. This guy's keeping the box away from the robot. He's very mean to the robot. This video usually kills. People usually think this is really funny. Anyway, the robot finally gets the box. In any case, as you can see, people are working on these, humanoid robot technologies. But I think it's going to be a while before you see one of these Atlas robots stocking shelves. And so in the short term, I wanted you guys to be thinking more about industrial robots and AI big data technologies, with these humanoid robots more distant. Okay. Get that full screen again. OK. So If you're interested in measures of how AI technologies are diffusing through the economy, I highly recommend, they just came out with their new annual report yesterday, the AI Index, which is provided by Stanford, which Eric Brynjolfsson, amongst others, work on, which has got all these sorts of metrics on how AI is being used in the economy and spending on AI technologies. So these figures are a year old, so I was hoping to get the new report in on time, but so you can go check it up yourself and see what you see. There's also some really exciting new figures. Anyway, spending has gone up dramatically. By VCs on AI startups has gone up dramatically. This figure, some of you guys are already going to know this stuff, so bear with me. What are AI, machine learning, and deep learning? Okay, so artificial intelligence is just sort of any system that is going to do things in an intelligent way. Traditionally, there have kind of been two sorts of approaches to this problem. One is something called good old-fashioned AI or expert systems, where you kind of try to write down step by step, first the computer does this, then the computer checks for that, if A, then B. And then sort of a more bottom-up approach that has recently become a lot more powerful, kind of based around machine learning, and throwing a lot of data at the computer, either in a supervised or an unsupervised way, and trying to get the computer to find the patterns in that. So machine learning is one approach to that, which is it's one approach to AI as opposed to expert systems. Why is the machine learning approach so much more important to the economy and seeming to be a lot more powerful than the expert systems approach? Well, one answer comes from an old economist called Polanyi, who told us Polanyi's paradox. And he said that his paradox is we know more than we can explain. The example that he gave of that was juggling, right? So suppose you know how to juggle, right? You practice for a while, eventually you figure out how to juggle. But if my friend comes up to me and says, hey, Seth, you know how to juggle, would you teach me how? I can't give him a list of steps. I can't say, start with the red ball in your right hand, throw velocity, and so on and so forth. The only way you can learn how to juggle isn't by being told how to juggle. You've just got to practice over and over again, right? And so that's kind of a fundamental limitation of these expert systems, is that humans know how to do lots of things, like recognize a face, that we can't say, these are the steps to recognizing Senen's face. First, does he wear glasses? Two, does he have a goatee, et cetera, in a way that you might play a Guess Who, which is an American board game. Okay. It's important to point, so deep learning is one particular way of doing machine learning using neural nets. That's become really popular, has a lot of power recently. And it's important to remember that we're not talking about an artificial general intelligence. We're still talking about these emerging technologies as being good at sort of one specific sorting task or organization task. And what I want to point out now is this technology has started to really diffuse. So important things that have helped to diffuse these neural nets are Fast AI, which is a massively online open course where you can learn how to use these neural nets. AutoML, which automates a lot of the machine learning process. And then Kaggle, even if you don't want to learn how to use these technologies yourself, Kaggle is a crowdsourcing company that I think was just bought by Microsoft or Google. Maybe it was Google, bought out by Google. Where you can go out and you say, hey, I have a big data problem, go out to the community, and then other people can figure out what the appropriate machine learning technique is to handle that big data problem. So you can outsource this knowledge. Okay, so one of the things that neural nets are really good at is recognizing images. Recently in the I forget what this acronym stands for. There's an annual competition to see how good these machine systems are at recognizing images. And recently, the best AI systems have passed human performance at the task of being provided an image and being able to identify what are the things in that image. And you should ask yourself, how many jobs are basically just image categorization, right? There's some sort of low-skill jobs like sorting fruit. And there's a sort of famous example online of a Japanese farmer who he farms cucumbers. And he got tired of having his mom having to sort cucumbers into by shape, right? So there are curvy cucumbers and straight cucumbers. You have to kind of sort them into different boxes before you sell them to the wholesaler. And his mom had done the task, and as a birthday present to her, he developed an automatic cucumber sorter that as the cucumbers came up, the neural net was able to identify, okay, these cucumbers go in that bin and vice versa. So that's a maybe example of a low-wage job that's an image categorization job. You also think of high-wage jobs that are image categorization jobs. So if you think of radiology, the task of a doctor of looking at a biopsy and determining, okay, is this cancer or not, it's kind of fundamentally just like an image recognition task. Okay, so just to give you an example of how easy it is to use these neural net technologies, I am not a computer scientist, but I used Fast.ai's tutorial, and I built a neural net to categorize images of tomatina versus San Fermines. So here are the 3 images the computer was most certain was San Fermines. Here are the images that the computer was most certain were tomatina. You can either ask the neural net. One of the challenges with neural nets is that they're a little bit opaque in terms of how they're making decisions about sorting, right? It's not like a linear regression where you can see, oh, this term enters as a predictor positively and this term enters as a predictor negatively. But one thing you can do with neural nets is you can just say, what part of this image looks like San Fermines? And unsurprisingly, the part of the image that looks like San Fermines is the bull. And again, I have no expertise in this. I just followed a tutorial online. My image categorizer, of the 800 images, I held out 1/3 for validation. And of that remaining third, I categorized all but 3 correctly. These are the 3 images that I mischaracterized, that the neural net misclassified. This guy over here, the computer thought might have been San Fermines, I think because she's wearing this red scarf, although she's also clearly covered in tomatoes. This image over here is San Fermines, but the computer thought was tomatina, or it was just barely, if you forced it to guess, thought it was tomatina, probably because of this big orange balloon. So I told you to think about, so what sort of tasks, what sort of occupations in the economy might be vulnerable to automation through these techniques. So Eric Brynjolfsson, along with my co-author of mine, another co-author of mine, Daniel Rock, went through and spoke to a series of experts and was able to think about, okay, what sort of tasks do we think machine learning is going to be really powerful at? And kind of the headline result is that machine learning should be powerful at tasks that map standard inputs to standard outputs, right? So an occupation that sounds a lot like that is a credit authorizer, right? So someone puts in an application for a loan, you crunch the numbers, either the person's creditworthy or they're not creditworthy. In some sense, you don't even want to use sort of personal, informal information. You just want to use, the objective facts in deciding who to give a loan. But on the other hand, something like massage therapists, right? It's hands-on, there's no standard input, there's no standard output. That's kind of thing that machine learning is not going to be very powerful for. Okay, so what did these co-authors do? What they did was they took 964 occupations and divided each of them up into about 10 or so tasks. So I think this comes from the Dictionary of Occupational Titles in the United States, divides occupations into the different tasks people in occupation do. And they have some good news and they have some bad news. The good news, for the perspective of people who might be automated. The good news is there are no or almost no occupations that are composed of tasks, all of which are suitable for machine learning, right? So almost every occupation has some small slice that's not suitable for automation. But on the other hand, almost every occupation had some slice that was suitable for automation, right? So that's kind of getting at this idea that I was trying to plant before, which is that the real question isn't what jobs are going to be destroyed and what jobs are going to be created, but more how can we reorganize jobs to automate the part that's automatable and get the humans to work on the part that's not automatable. So giving an example of job reorganization and why this is maybe more challenging than it sounds, more challenging than just slicing a job in half and having half done by the computer and half done by the person. One example of that is sort of the last mile problem for Amazon, right? So one of these technologies that we think is going to come out soon are driverless cars. And so you might imagine Amazon being able to automate the process of getting the box in the factory onto the truck. The truck is an automated driverless truck that drives to the house. But then there's that last step, which is that the package needs to be taken out of the truck, and somebody has to march up to the door, ring the doorbell, talk to somebody, navigate weird steps, make some sort of decision about if the person the package is there for isn't there, but maybe their friend is, who to leave it with. That last step is something that's very hard to automate, even if the first steps are very automatable. And why that's important in this case is, even if you could automate the portion of the driving a truck around, you still need the guy to sit in the truck the whole time to do that last minute of delivery. So reorganizing these jobs is much easier said than done. It's very hard sometimes to separate the automated part from the non-automated part in a functional way that would save people time. Now, I focused on this idea of machine vision, and obviously that's just one example of something you can do with artificial intelligence. But I think it's an example that's particularly interesting for, I'm going to give a biological metaphor here. So, back when Earth had, single cell and multicellular life, it's kind of a long period of time in which organisms were pretty unsophisticated. And then Cambrian explosion, and there were lots and lots of different sorts of animals, proto-animals emerging. It's always sort of been a riddle in biology about what happened at that one moment, that one geological epoch that led to this great explosion in the diversity of life. And so one answer that people have given is that, well, that came about with the development of the eye. So the first creatures developed eyes, and that opened up a whole new universe of possible creature types. So I think that's a little bit suggestive of the idea that machine vision is going to be a really important step forward for automation technologies. What can't computers do? Well, like I said, the mapping of standardized inputs to standardized outputs. Even if you think they're really good at predicting things, even in that standardized input, standardized output, that's maybe not giving you a causal relationship. And if you think about what scientists want to do, they don't only want to predict does B happen, they want to know what causes B, which is a different question, right? And then finally, there's kind of an open question about to what extent can AI be creative, right? So on its face, no, but I can throw this image of San Fermines through a neural net that is designed to recognize animal shapes and plant shapes and things, and you get this sort of hallucinogenic image of the bulls and the people turned into birds and popsicle sticks. I don't know if you want to call that creativity, but it's trippy. Okay. So open questions and challenges. How am I doing on time?
You're running out of time.
I'm running out of time. Okay, great. All right.
But I think that 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Okay, great. I do want to have time for questions, so I'll be a little bit faster. Yeah. So open questions. Cool. So here are some open questions, technological growth, some of this stuff I'm working on, some of this I just really want to know the answer to, so if you have an answer, please tell me. The first is, to what extent is technology directable? So I told you a story in which there are these technologies emerging, and the economy just has to react to them. But there's sort of an open question about, obviously businesses, when they do R&D, are hoping to get a certain sort of result. When governments invest in research projects, they're hoping to get a technology that's going to do a certain thing. So an open question is how elastic is what we discover to what businesses or governments throw their money at. And that's going to have long-term implications, because if wages continue going down for certain kinds of workers, that should raise the incentive to invent things for those low-wage workers to do, right? Because if you're inventing a job, you want to invent a job where you can pay a low wage. And so, if the ability mechanism exists, that's something that's going to tend to prop up, that's going to help workers who are seeing their wages decrease. And if, technology is just this blind force, who knows what's going to happen next. Second, is technological growth accelerating or decelerating? We have kind of I think a lot of us have the sense that technological growth is accelerating, but and one reason for that might be Weitzman's combinatoric growth paper, which is the idea that if ideas are combinations of other ideas, then the amount of ideas should grow in this super exponential way, this combinatoric way. But there's also people who think that technological change is decelerating. Gordon has a book, Rise and Fall of American Growth, which suggests that, oh no, we already invented all the good stuff. Indoor plumbing, electricity, that stuff was really cool. Machine learning sucks. So I don't know if you buy that idea. And then kind of more with more microdata, Bloom, Jones, Van Reenen, and Webb have a paper where they look at the returns to research and development. And they show, hey, look, Moore's law has been slowing down, but firms have been throwing more and more budget at trying to develop new microchips. So that return has been decreasing. We see the rate at which new pharmaceuticals are being invented is slowing down, but companies are throwing much more money at pharmaceutical research. So it seems like that rate of technological change is decreasing. So that's sort of a question. I think the answer I lean towards is that there's a lot of technological change that's unobserved right now and will maybe manifest itself in the future. And finally, why secular stagnation? So we've seen a lot, if technological growth is so great that it's lowering labor share, why is it that wages are stagnant, interest rates are low? Well, maybe wages being stagnant, I have an obvious answer, labor share is going down. But why are interest rates low? Why aren't businesses investing more? Why isn't growth faster? And the answer that Brynjolfsson and I come up with is, well, not everyone knows how to implement or has the ability to implement these new technologies. And these superstar workers and firms are superstars because they either have the ability or the knowledge to implement the new technologies, and so they're making lots and lots of profits, but the rest of the economy is still kind of slow going. And so the real challenge is, how do we get those technologies diffused throughout the economy? And this is what I just talked about. So if labor share is going down, you would expect more money to go capital, yet interest rates have gone down. Here are 4 measures of the US real rate of return to investment, all been going down. And so my story is that these superstars are the scarce complement who are getting a bigger share of output. Automation. So there's lots of challenges here. One challenge is distributional, right? So I think a lot of us have the sense, I certainly have the sense, that if the economy is changing in such a way that the rewards are going to a smaller and smaller share of the economy, then we should do something to democratize that. We should make sure that all of us gain from economic growth. And so that means that you need some sort of, you have 2 options, which are some sort of barrier to these technological changes, either a tax or a ban, or some sort of redistributive technology, or some sort of redistribution. Most economists lean towards the second. Cosno and Verning have a paper called on this exact subject, which says that even if it's very imprecise, even if it's only with a lot of friction, that you can tax rich people and give the money to poor people, you're still better off doing mostly that and not taxing the new technologies. But outside of distributional effects, there are other things you might want to worry about. One is, if you have insufficient job training, you can get structural unemployment. There's a period of time where the new jobs that are being created, all of the unemployed people have the wrong skills. And then if you're thinking about posting a job with the new skills, you might be hesitant because you know you're only going to get applications from people who have the old skills. So that'd be a friction that can hypothetically get bad, would be maybe a reason you want to slow down the adoption of new technologies. So there's intergenerational impacts, which is people who are older and retirees. A, they're not going to be affected by automation because they're already retired. And B, there's some evidence from Acemoglu and Restrepo have a paper that suggests that within factories, older workers are less likely to be laid off when industrial machines are brought in. And that's because the older workers at the factories aren't the ones on the assembly line. They're the ones who have sort of institutional knowledge about how the factory works, and they're kind of more in sales or management positions, and so they're less affected. And then finally, then a second mechanism of intergenerational is if we lower wages, and you think that most saving and investment in the economy is done by young people who are saving for retirement, then you should expect there to be less saving and investment overall as we lower the labor share, and that can hypothetically also have negative long-term consequences of we have these robots, but there's not enough of them. And then finally, more speculatively, you might imagine you don't want a society that has all of these super advanced technologies and people don't interact with each other. So these are the two kind of flip sides. Isaac Asimov has a book called The Caves of Steel, which is a future where robots can do everything, but there's not a lot of them, so everyone's very poor. And The Sun, which is a future where robots can do everything, and there's a lot of them, and then humans get really weird because each of them have like an empire of robots to do their bidding, and they never actually interact with other humans. And finally, Nick Bostrom, very influential and insightful researcher at Cambridge, is kind of more worried about like the robot uprising of robots having what he calls misaligned incentives, aka robots killing all humans. We'll focus on implementation skills, but in the long term, you got to do what the kinds of things that people fundamentally want humans to do, right? I was talking with some people at Brown at their Humanities-Centered Robotics Institute, and we were joking that like after they have automated cars, in Britain they'll still have actual human bus drivers, and they'll call them artisanal bus drivers, and they'll yell at you as you get on and stuff, right? So there's a question of, so there's 2 points there. The first is, in the long run, humans are going to have jobs doing things that only humans can do. And the question of what is something that only humans can do is sort of a question about taste and style and what do people care about being provided in an artisanal way rather than a standardized automated way. I made this joke already. There's my meme. Reorganizing is going to be important. If you can become a platform, that's great because platforms make lots of money. Investors, platforms are great, invest in them. There's going to be a challenge with overcapacity in some industries, right? If some industries become very, very productive because of these robots, there'll be a challenge in trying to shut down some of that production. There's a famous anecdote of this in American history where there was the invention of radial tires. So previous to this, tires would wear out extremely fast. And after this technological change, tires lasted almost 4 times as long, but cost the same amount to produce. And so suddenly, there were 4 times too many tire factories. And so outside investors had to come in and shut down these businesses that were unprofitable. So that's potentially an investment opportunity in the future. Governments, you're going to have to do transfers to try to get money to workers who are hurt by this, because I don't see anything obvious in technological change that's going to do this. I see technological change as continuing to promote employment polarization and inequality. There are different sorts of ways you might go about helping lower wage people. Universal basic income is one, and negative income tax is one. Minimum wages and labor protections, I think, have a lot of downsides. I think, if anything, we should be increasing flexibility, and the gig economy and things like Uber allow us ways of doing that and helping people interact and solve problems that aren't standard, which is the kind of things that can't be automated. And there's different ways. Data is labor is another proposal I'm happy to talk about. But I definitely want to get to questions, so I think I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. So,
one of the main things that your topic and you have end up with is the concept of platforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
The key role of platforms in the current economy.
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays, I mean, platforms, most of these platforms, or most of the successful platforms, work in offering free services for people, right? So there's a debate in the last years about that these free services run into a business model that is called the attention of the economy, or the economy of attention.
Sure.
Economy of attention, right? And there's people that have been involved on developing these business models that are not happy with this model because they know, we see which are the consequences of this economy of attention. So they are proposing changing the business model and say, hey, pay for the service because it's bad to use your data and use your privacy, to compensate the cost of the service, right? Could you comment on that and how this possible change of the business models of platforms could impact on economy?
Okay, great question. So the question is about free platforms and kind of pros and cons of that and maybe how they're going to develop. So I think the first place to start is people really like free stuff, right? So that's probably why free stuff is a popular business model. And I think one of the questions that was asked was, should we discourage people, or are people either on their own going to move away from services where effectively there's the old joke where if you can't find the product is you, right? Are people either on their own going to move away from services where the business model is capturing your attention and capturing your data and giving you something for free and preferring to move to a free service, a paid service, or will there be some either sort of social pressure or government pressure to move away from those models? I think this is an area in which Americans have very different intuitions than Europeans. Europe has moved very much in the direction of privacy and data protection with things like GDPR, whereas in America, people are sort of much more comfortable with businesses having their data. If you give Americans the choice of free and you give away your data or paid and you keep your data, everyone's going to choose the free option. And I think from like an efficiency standpoint, data is non-rival, right? It's not, so sometimes people say things that data is the new oil or data is the new energy because it's powering all these new businesses. But one important difference between data and those things is it's not like if I use the data, you can't use the data, right? Everyone can use the data and everyone can become more efficient, right? And it would be great if we could use that data to do things other than just sell ads, which is how a lot of that data is being used right now. But my intuition is the opposite. My intuition is we really should be trying to use, non-rival inputs are great because everyone can use them. If anything, we should try to get more small businesses access to the big data that gives the giant companies their advantages over small businesses. Privacy remains a concern, but a lot of those concerns remain hypothetical at this point, and I'd prefer to deal with kind of more specific problems as they come up. I think I answered most of that question. Okay.
The value of these free services is huge. In fact, bro, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce.
Brynjolfsson?
Yes,
okay.
He and
Avi Gavinani.
His co-authors
yeah.
Have calculated the value of these free services.
And they're fantastic. They're huge.
Most important
yeah.
ones, for example, search engines, social networks, email, and if you consider just the most popular of them, the value per capita per year is close to $40,000.
Yeah.
Which is a huge amount of money.
And it's all not measured in GDP.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic point. I don't want to, if you were getting to a question, I'm happy to riff on that. Okay.
No, it's not a question. It's just
yeah.
How many money obtain these companies if for you these free services, the value of these free services is close to $40,000.
Yeah.
They obtain much more money than that.
Yeah. if you think about it, like consumers are getting a fantastic deal on these free services, right? So to give the example of Facebook, because I was looking at these numbers recently, Facebook makes about $100 a year on the average American user of Facebook, or it makes about maybe about half of that on the average European user of Facebook in terms of revenue. So the marginal cost of Facebook is pretty low, so I think you can think of that as just profit on the margin. And so how much value do people actually get from Facebook? Well, they get like $50 or $60 a month from Facebook in terms of value. In terms of, if I went to you and I said, how much would I have to pay you, Facebook user, to give up Facebook for the next month? The median answer is somewhere around $50. So if you compare that 100 number to that $100 a year to $50 a month, about $600 a year, most of the surplus from these free services, perhaps unsurprisingly because they're free, are going to the consumers. So obviously there are a lot of concerns about data and about, we're providing a lot of value to these really profitable companies, but we're getting a lot of value back too. And so sometimes I think the rhetoric goes a little bit too far. So this last data point, data as labor. So Glenn Weil is the chief economist of Microsoft. And Microsoft is sort of against perhaps unsurprisingly, is a little bit against these business models that make huge amounts of money off of big data, because relative to Google and Facebook, they're a little bit behind in the big data game. If you compare the size of LinkedIn to the size of Facebook, it's tiny, right? And so he has this idea, which is that people should be compensated for the value of the data that they give onto their firms, right? And he presents this as like a fairness issue. But I think that argument, it's not wrong, but I find it not super persuasive for two reasons. The first is, as we point out, we do get a lot of value from these free services. It's not like we're getting nothing from providing these data. We get all these we get Google, we get Gmail, we get Facebook, we get Instagram, we get all these wonderful online services for free. And then the second point is, you might hope that this would reduce inequality, right? So, hey, there's all these super profitable businesses. If we took that money and gave it to the people providing the data, that would reduce inequality, right? The answer is probably not, because if you actually look into the details of how a sort of data as labor policy would work, it would likely be the case that the people whose data is the most valuable are the richest people, right? If most of what we're using this data for is to sell ads, data on rich people who might buy luxury cars is much more valuable than data on a lower income person who's deciding between Burger King and McDonald's. So yeah, I think you make a really good point.
Any questions? Sonia.
So thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. It's not usual that we have the opportunity to hear someone talking about technology, but from a different point of view, from the economic point of view. So you mentioned at the beginning that at the MIT, in this initiative for digital economy, there were people coming from the business area and people coming from the technology area. And I was wondering if you do not have also the perspective more by anthropologists or sociologists or even psychologists or people from the cultural area. I think that would also enrich the discussion you make about all these subjects.
So the question was, do we have any sort of sociology, anthropology input at the MIT and the Initiative on Digital Economy, the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy? And the answer is not enough. I don't think we have enough. There are some efforts to deal with what you might think are broader social issues in terms of digital economy. So one thing we didn't talk about today is algorithmic fairness, right, and algorithmic bias, which is the idea that even if you can predict something, if you're predicting something in such a way that disadvantages a minority group in an unfair way, well, maybe you don't want to be predicting it that way, even if it's the decision that minimizes your R squared, either in a myopic way or in a long-term way. And so there is some really, to be honest, the way primarily we engage with that question at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy is in a statistical sense, right? We say, all right, let's write down mathematically a definition of fairness, and then how can we build that into the algorithm? But when you think about it, the reason we care about fairness is not for the sake of meeting some sort of super abstract mathematical equation. We care about fairness because we care about how people are buying into the system, and we care about, do people have a sense that they're being ripped off or not? And those are really much more anthropological questions and sociological questions than they are mathematical questions. And so we should be doing more of that.
You talked about natural monopolies. We know already about the classical monopolies that became in the early 20th century and so on. But nowadays, with these new monopolies, there are international companies and there are no governments actually that can rule. They have to. Is there some way, some research of building into a system something that avoids the usual pitfall of monopolies, of the stagnation and so on? Some way of building it before it actually becomes a monopoly and gets all those problems that it will have?
It's a really fantastic question. And the short answer is I don't have a great answer. So the question was, it looks like some of these platforms and are, in essence, natural monopolies, and we know all the problems with monopolies, so how can we deal with that in a regulatory sense? One traditional answer for dealing with natural monopolies is to have them run as government businesses, right? So if you think about the provision of roads, the provision of electricity, those things are sometimes thought of as natural monopolies because it doesn't make sense for us to have two parallel systems of roads, one of which owned by company A and one owned by company B. It doesn't make sense to have two sets of electrical grids or 4 or 5 sets of electrical grids, each owned by a different company, right? There's some sense in which these should be public commons and either run directly by the government or run in very, very heavily regulated, public-private partnerships or something like that. And that's been a solution for these sorts of problems in the past, although if you look across the United States and you look at how local businesses, how these private-public partnerships have been run, they tend to be corrupt and bad and inefficient. So it's not clear that that's a great answer to the problem. In addition, we don't think there's going to be there hasn't been a lot of innovation in building roads. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in building electrical grids over the last 50 or so years, whereas for these platforms, they're constantly innovating. That's how they stay on top, right? And so that's another reason why you might want to be cautious about a super regulated model, right? Okay, so remember, when you have a natural monopoly, the concern about a monopoly is always that they're going to set the price too high, right? And too few people are going to use it. They're going to abuse their market power. But for most of these platforms, the price is either really low or free, right? So if they're a monopoly, they're being exploitive in a very sort of weird, untraditional way. Now, you might give an example of something like Apple's App Store, where they take 30% off the top of every transaction on the App Store, and that seems a lot more like a traditional bad monopoly and something we should do something about. But for something like Facebook and Google, where they're providing most of their services for free or for very low cost, and they don't seem to have an obvious competitor because it makes sense for there just to be one giant company, the answer is probably not to regulate them heavier. The answer is probably ultimately, ideally, find some way to just tax them more and get that money redistributed to lower income people. But I don't think for those companies there's a severe issue with there being an under-provision of the good, which is the classic monopoly problem.
Yeah, the problem is not so much about the money, but they are not yet complete monopolies. They've only been monopolies for at least 5, maybe 10 years.
Sure.
In the case of Google. The problem is all these pitfalls that monopolies have, they stagnate.
Mm-hmm.
They stop innovating, these kind of things. How can they avoid it once they actually do become monopolies? And where's the incentive for something like Facebook once they bought all the other
social networks. Yeah.
There are no other social networks you can go.
It's a great question. Certainly, there'll have to be regulation to prevent creation of barriers to entry. Right? We want entry of new social networks to be as easy as possible. And there is a big barrier, which is but I mean, I will say Facebook is a curious example because like Facebook did disrupt MySpace, right? So this happened once, right? So I don't think it's impossible that it'll happen again. The optimist in me says that once Facebook starts to stagnate really heavily, we will get a competitor and a successor emerge.
We don't have examples with something that big.
Well, I mean, MySpace was big for its time, but I mean, there have been super entrenched monopolies in the past which have seen their time go. That's the optimist in me. If you actually got into a scenario where you had a big stagnant Facebook that hasn't changed in 10 years and is now charging $5 a person every day to use Facebook, then I think the case for a much more heavy government regulation would be called for. Yeah.
So the last question, because we are running out of time.
There are a lot of challenges we are facing in terms of new technologies, and I would like to know 3 measures you would take if you were the prime minister of a small country in terms of 3 areas: education, labor market, and research and innovation.
Okay.
You could make you have all the power.
Okay. Labor market, the number one thing I'm going to do, I don't know if this is a problem in Spain, it's a problem in America, which is sort of exclusion clauses in labor markets. So sometimes when you hire a worker, there'll be a rule when they sign up saying, if you work for me, you're not allowed to work with any of my competitors for the next X years, right? I think those are horrible rules. They make labor less flexible. It makes it harder for employers to bid up wages. And perhaps most importantly, it makes it harder for these technologies to diffuse across companies, right? What I think one of the big lessons here is we need to make it easier for the really super powerful technologies that Google has to diffuse into the rest of the economy. And when Google's able to have a rule saying all of my leading experts aren't allowed to work for any other company after they work for me, that's going to prevent that. Okay, so that's my labor market answer. Education answer, train people to implement these new technologies. We need more computer scientists, but we also need more people with soft skills that are going to be the kinds of things that can't be automated. So people who, if you think about sort of jobs that are the least automatable, we saw things like massage therapists. You can think about things like coaches, things where the personal touch is so important, I think are going to be jobs of the future. And then the third thing was R&D. I'd like to see, so this gets back to that question of to what extent is technology directable, right? If technology is not directable, it doesn't matter what I say is going to be our R&D policy. But if our R&D policy is something that's going to have an effect on the world, you want to see R&D devoted towards creating jobs, creating products that are intensive in the skills that people who are unemployed or have low wages provide. And that's kind of a complicated question, but that would be the goal if you could point to the R&D labs towards that.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming. It was really, really interesting, the talk and this debate. And we spent the whole day here in this center. I'm talking about the center, developing technology and talking about technology. And I think that this kind of talks is very important in order to think about the impact of the technology in the society, in the economy, ethical issues, and things like that. So thank you very much for coming. It was really interesting. And you are welcome in the future.
Thank you, guys. You've been wonderful hosts.